On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, Japan, had the first atomic bomb the world has ever seen, dropped on its streets. Only 3 days later, Nagasaki, Japan, also experienced an atomic bomb.
Truman's decision to use nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed the way conflict has developed throughout the world, and by opening the possibility for nuclear warfare, he created a new arms race that enveloped the world in fear and tension that developed mainly between the Soviet Union and the United States.
President Truman's decision to drop the atomic bombs was heavily influenced by Japan's initial refusal of unconditional surrender and the Allies' inability to easily invade the Japanese home front. However, the ultimate reason that factored into the decision to begin nuclear warfare was the desire to end World War II.
Allied B-29 bomber planes flew over Japan carrying the two atomic bombs nicknamed Little Boy and Fat Man. Little Boy carried the force of more than 15,000 tons of TNT, while Fat Man was more forceful than 20,000 tons. Both bombs had the ability and did completely demolish the two cities.
Though the United States and the USSR worked together to bring about the end of World War II, the basic differences in these nations' principles created an irreparable rift between them.
And thus began the Cold War. The term Cold War was used for the first time in 1947 by the American statesman Bernard Baruch when he said,
"Let us not be deceived. We are today in the midst of a Cold War."
According to World History by Era, as early as 1947, President Harry S. Truman asserted the U.S. intent to support nations in their efforts to maintain or establish democratic independence and combat Soviet and other aggression.
An excerpt from his congressional address on March 12, 1947, Truman said,
"If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation. Great responsibilities have been placed upon us by the swift movement of events."
The United States government became very paranoid about the spread of communism and sought to prevent it from spreading at all costs. Often, this included the support of small democratic parties of otherwise communist nations.
Specifically, the United States supported the nationalist portion of China in 1980 and aided South Korea in their conflict against North Korea in 1953. The biggest blow to the Democratic side, however, was in Vietnam, where they stayed and fought from 1959 to 1975, only to face crushing defeat by the Vietnamese forces.
In 1961, when Kennedy came into office, concurrent with the war in Vietnam, he learned of a plot by the U.S. government intended to neutralize the communist rule of Castro. Publicly, there was no plot to overthrow the Cuban government, and Kennedy denied the United States' involvement in any existing plan. On April 12, 1961, he stated,
"The basic issue in Cuba is not one between the United States and Cuba. It is between the Cubans themselves. I intend to see that we adhere to that principle, and as I understand it, this administration's attitude is so understood and shared by the anti-Castro exiles from Cuba in this country."
A mere 5 days later, on April 17, 1961, the United States forces attempted to overthrow the Cuban government at what has come to be known as the Bay of Pigs. The attempt, according to the Cold War history and documents, was an unmitigated disaster. The Cubans followed the lead of Fidel Castro, not that of the expatriate leaders, leaving the U.S. embarrassingly exposed to the rest of the world for its clumsy efforts to overthrow a sovereign government.
On August 13, 1961, the same year as the Bay of Pigs, construction of the Berlin Wall commenced. The purpose of the wall was to further separate a city already divided after World War II. The Soviet east side of Berlin was cut off from the democratic west, and the people were effectively prevented from leaving. 2 years later, however, Kennedy used the wall as a symbol for the Western nations' solidarity.
Conflict with the Soviet Union did not stop there, however. In October of 1962, footage obtained by the United States showed Soviet missiles being placed in Cuba. The Soviet presence itself was not shocking. However, the idea of hostile nuclear weapons so close to home was.
After being humiliated at the Bay of Pigs, the United States was not about to back down from this new confrontation. In response to the missiles, Kennedy ordered a quarantine of Cuba. In reality, it was a naval blockade, but calling it such would be an act of war. Thus, the U.S. ships blocked the Cuban harbors, while the Soviet ships steamed closer to their destination.
This continued for 2 days until the Soviet leader called back the ships and sent Kennedy a letter promising to remove the missiles if the United States ended the blockade and stayed out of Cuba. A second letter from the Soviet leader to Kennedy addressed the issue of the American arms in Turkey, a letter which was ignored.
The only nuclear weapon available up until the 1950s was the atomic bomb, a weapon which required splitting atoms to create the blast. On March 1, 1954, the world's first hydrogen bomb was detonated.
The hydrogen bomb was an advancement made by the United States in an attempt to stay one step ahead of everyone else. Other nations, including the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China, had managed to acquire nuclear atomic bombs. Of course, the U.S. had to stay ahead of everyone else, and this required the creation of a new weapon.
As the Soviet Union and the United States began to stockpile nuclear arms, tension began to increase worldwide. The threat of fallout and radiation sicknesses in particular worried the citizens. Because of this, the Civil Defense Campaign began with an unparalleled vigor. Children worldwide were taught to duck and cover and hide under their desks in case of a threat. A famed character from this period is Bert the Turtle, who is featured in comic books and animated short films.
Because of all the public concern stemming from the effects of nuclear testing and actual health detriments, in 1972 the Strategic Arms Limitation talks began, SALT for short. In essence, SALT was an attempt and success to limit the tensions between the U.S. and Soviet hostilities and to prevent more stockpiling of nuclear arms. SALT, according to World History by Era, the nuclear age, quote, limited the deployment of anti-ballistic missiles, weapons designed to destroy incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, with nuclear warheads. SALT also forbade the building of additional nuclear warheads.
Almost as suddenly as it had started, the Cold War ended in the 1980s with a U.S. increase in military spending that the Soviet Union could not match. Then, in the 1990s, the United States became a singular world power.
The Cold War was a conflict in which a battle was never fought, at least not in the traditional sense. A turning point in history, the creation of the atomic bomb and all that came after forced the world to dramatically change the way of war, peace, and foreign relations on a whole.
The impact of nuclear weapons is still felt today in a more positive manner. The technique used to create nuclear blasts is now used in power plants that produce relatively clean energy. In a sense, the creation of nuclear technology has come full circle and is now being used to pioneer another turning point in history.